Welcome back. We've been discussing occultism, the occult path, as part of the global diversity of religious heritage. And last time we mentioned how its flourishing has mainly been in the Western Hemisphere. Whilst there are strands and strains of occultism in all the world's religions, the chief provenance and field of activity for the occult path has been in the West, originating around the Mediterranean, spreading up through Europe, and being transplanted in a big way into the New World in America. Last time I contrasted the mystical path, which is prominent in the Far East, with the prophetic path, which is prominent in the Middle East, and the occult path, more to do with the West. So there is a bit of a geographic distribution, and there's a sort of parallelism between the geography and the ways of approaching the ultimate mystery, the ultimate reality that human beings have embarked upon. Now, remember, in the mystical path, these religions are essentially religions that are grounded in mystical experience. Their founders have had critical, seminal, mystical experiences from which the religion stems, but also the aspirants, adherents in those faith traditions are aiming for a similar mystical experience. It's the touchstone of whether you've made it or not. Remember, the mystical path attempts to transcend dualism by merging the individual soul into the oversoul, the finite into the infinite, the human into God, the ultimate reality. That's called monism philosophically, because mono is one. So it's about attaining oneness. The prophetic way, the way of the Abrahamic faiths, I'm looking at Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, Baha'ism, has always been to maintain that dualism between man and God, and therefore it's required mediators. And we mentioned the priests, prophets and kings, and the importance of prayer as against meditation, which is the primary vehicle in the East. We also mentioned the reliance on miracle rather than magic, which we find with the occult path. Now, there is a similarity, a superficial similarity between the occult path and the mystical path, the occult path of the West and the mystical path of the East, and it is this, that both of them attempt to transcend dualism. In the case of the occult path, the dualism is transcended by the attempt to assimilate the Godhead to the individual, to lay claim to the creative powers of divinity, so that the difference between the human being and God is ultimately annihilated, obliterated. As we saw, the extreme manifestation of occultism is to regard oneself as a kind of God, a kind of deity, with the creative powers attached to that. So it's monistic in that sense as well. It's attempting to get beyond the dualism that we find in the religions coming out of the Middle East and Arabia and so on.
Ego-based.
It's ego-based in the sense of assimilating the Godhead to the ego, whereas the mystical paths are the opposite of ego-based.
That's right.
Even though they're attempting to reach a point of oneness, they're attempting to dissolve the ego because they think that the ego is the problem, this separative sense of self. For the occultists, the ego is not the problem. The ego needs to be built up, empowered, imbued with the powers of the deity, especially the creative power. So we need to grasp that and then to understand historically where some of these ideas come from. Is there anything else by way of preliminary questions or points that you wanted to raise, Belinda?
Probably will throughout.
Okay. Now, again, last time we mentioned that in the Genesis myth, the two paths, the traditional Judeo-Christian religious path, the biblical way, is delineated from the occult path at the very beginning through a powerfully evocative myth of the Garden of Eden, where the serpent enters in and tempts Adam and Eve, via Eve, to eat of a particular tree which God had warned them, commanded them, in fact, not to eat from, lest they should die. Now, this was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They are invited to eat from the tree of life. And these are profound mystical and metaphysical symbols in a way. The tree of life is used in Genesis in the Bible and notably in the book of Revelation. And it is a cosmic mandala for the creative processes of the universe. It has relevance to understanding the deity and also to man's functioning. It's often associated with Jewish mysticism and metaphysics, or the, let's put it this way, the esoteric side of Judaism. But from at least the Renaissance onwards, it also contributed to the esoteric side of Christianity. Now that's the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was mentioned by the serpent, and Adam and Eve were invited to eat of it because eating of that tree, eating of its fruit, which looked appealing and attractive, would give them godlike powers. They would know good and evil, which is archetypal for all the polarities, good and evil, right and wrong, above, below, within, without, all the polarities, joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain, frustration and exaltation. And through knowing these polarities and having to make choices between them, they would grow. But naturally, they would have to grow through experimentation, through a process of trial and error. Now, wherever there's a process of trial and error, there's always the possibility of error. And the name religion gives to error is sin. So in eating of that tree, sin enters into the picture, and death as the wages of sin enters into the picture. So the serpent was attempting to say, you shall not die. God's misleading you. But certainly death marks life, and really underscores our finitude, our mortality. So in attempting to become like gods, Adam and Eve end up being reminded of their mortality and also the struggle of human existence. Woman brings forth children in childbirth in pain, which was not meant to be the case originally, and man has to earn his feed by the toil of his brow, so work becomes somewhat of a penance, a punishment, and a drudgery as well. There's not an effortless creative enterprise there. Now, in the course of biblical history, there have been other civilizations that have interacted with the historic peoples of the Bible and the biblical tradition. And they've been more custodians of what we might call occultism. And those people include the Egyptians, the great civilization of ancient Egypt, and it includes the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and other peoples dotted around the Mediterranean who developed mystery religions, mystery cults in the ancient world. So we're looking at Middle Eastern and Mediterranean civilizations who had developed a lot of teachings around these things. We know, for example, that a lot of the star lore and knowledge of the cosmos and of the stars is neither good nor bad. It depends upon how it's used, but it's the same with knowledge generally. I mean, we are talking here about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, knowledge is not a bad thing, of course, and just because one knows something doesn't make one bad. I mean, we're not meant to live in a state of ignorance as human beings now that we've developed self-consciousness and choice. We're out of the garden, to be sure, that primeval state of innocence and simplicity. And so these civilizations surrounding the historic biblical lands and the biblical peoples have cultivated and been custodians of star knowledge, but they've also been custodians of what's called Hermetic knowledge. In ancient Egypt, Thoth was the ibis-headed god of scribes, of writing, and of knowledge in a way. And after the conquest of Alexander the Great, he installed successors of one of his generals, Ptolemy, on the throne of the pharaoh in Egypt. So from the 300s till the end of the Egyptian civilization, that's not the end of the Egyptian civilization, but to the end of Egyptian rulership over its civilization under Queen Cleopatra, who was the last of the Ptolemies, about the time that the Roman Empire was consolidating. It was a Greek line of rulers that sat on the throne. Before that, they were rulers of Egyptian blood, but from about 330s to the 30s, so for about 300 years, the last 300 years of official rule of the pharaonic civilization, they were of Greek blood, but they were very familiar with Egyptian culture, and some were more partial to it and more promoting of the mysteries of ancient Egypt than others. And Queen Cleopatra, the famous historical queen, the lover of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the woman who took her life after Mark Antony was defeated and at the Battle of Actium, she was particularly involved in a revival of the Egyptian mysteries associated with the Egyptian religion. Now, a lot of literature was written from the BC centuries, because originally the traditions were oral. They were held by the priests and the temple initiates, and then in the time after Christ, in the first couple of centuries after Christ, they were written down in Greek. So it was a kind of Greek-Egyptian team-up to produce what's called the Hermetic literature. So called because it references a legendary figure called Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great Hermes. Now you might remember that Hermes was the Greek god, the Greek messenger god, who had similar qualities to Thoth. And in the Roman pantheon, he was called Mercury. So this was a god that communicated messages from the above to the below, and wisdom and knowledge, and a god of scribes to write it all down. So Hermes was this legendary figure, and we can't pinpoint him in history as an actual human being that existed, but there were legends and teachings that were associated with him that went right back. But the Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermetic teachings, was written down in the first few centuries of the Christian era. And it was this body that formed the basis of Hermeticism, which underwent a huge revival during the European Renaissance, many centuries later. And some of the main ideas of Hermeticism, being a very significant strand of occultism, it's one of those ingredients that really kicked off Western occultism and the Western mystery tradition. And some of the key ideas were that the universe was a product of mind. We call that mentalism. So the divine being thought up the universe essentially. It was an outgrowth of his mind. And
willing it into existence.
Yes. And more than that, everything around us is a kind of idea in the divine mind. And also human beings sort of created in the image, and this is where it's a bit like the Bible, man being created in the image of God.
So we should be able to do that too.
That's where it's getting to, yes. The human being
pretty profound, Thomas.
has this power within their own mind to shape reality.
That's scary.
It's a creative power. It's scary.
It's scary if you don't know how to control it.
It's exciting. It's
if you're not a master of it, it's scary.
It's explosive, isn't it?
You have to know what you're doing.
It's world changing, because if the Hermetica are read correctly, it's saying that same creative power, where God, the ultimate cause, can bring things into existence by thought. Everything's a manifestation of thought. Well, that causative power and capability and faculty exists in the human being.
It's funny, when I was younger, I had an ability to do that to a degree. Not to a large degree, but for little things. I used to focus my thoughts and things would come into my life.
I think it's natural for most human beings to have experimented with that at some time or another.
But it happens in your youth
what can I
when
control
you don't have
with
all
my
these
thoughts?
boundaries
Yeah.
and doubts and whatnot.
Yes.
And then it went away.
Right? And certainly we all do this. Every business that plans, every human being that sets goals is engaged in this activity to some degree. We believe that to some extent we can control the future, what's going to manifest, and we can shape our circumstances.
But you've got to
So-
know what for.
Well, yes, that's the devil's in the detail.
Yeah.
So
That's where it becomes dangerous.
mm,
You
Another-
can't just will things for the sake of it.
yeah, a few other ingredients of Hermeticism, these principles attached to Hermes Trismegistus and got written down in the Greek language. The famous one of the emerald tablet, as above, so below. What happens in the heavens happens on the earth. Right? So that principle comes from Hermeticism. Another one would be that energy is ubiquitous. Everything is energy in oscillation, energy in waves. And that there is such a thing as polarity in the universe. That's in the DNA of the universe, the male and the female energy and the polarity. And it manifests in so many ways. But there is a cosmic order and a purpose in there being male and female. Again, this is another point in which the Hermetic wisdom is similar to the biblical wisdom. He created them male and female. So these are some of the things that Hermeticism promotes. The theory of correspondences, as above, so below. You could also add to that, as within, so without. Then the mentalism, the principle of mentalism, whereby all of this is a creation of mind. The principle of polarity and the principle of, what would you call it, sexuality. But there's also this notion that in the beginning there was an androgyny. So there's an androgynous being, and from that comes the sexual polarity. So that would do for this video. We've established that there's a stream of Hermeticism coming out of the Greco-Egyptian culture in the early centuries of the Christian era. Now, that has to be taken up at a later point in history.